There have been countless releases of Assassin's Creed DLCs throughout the years, and I thought why not make a video ranking all of them. Keep in mind that this is just my opinion, so feel free to disagree. There will also be spoilers for all of the DLCs, so be careful. So without further ado, let's get on with the video. In last place we have the Odyssey DLCs. These are the worst DLCs in my opinion, as they break the law very badly. In the Legacy of the First Blade, they completely made the Leap of Fate lose its meaning due to them completely ignoring that Bayek was the first one to start this tradition. Another thing that they did badly was putting assassin iconography in scenes that it did not make sense in, like making random Templar characters say things like "all things are permitted" with no real meaning behind those words. The ending was also a retcon that seemed really ridiculous, with Aya being a descendant of too many important people that just felt too convenient. The scene that they used to explain this was also really funny, as they showed the pyramids being built even though they were constructed close to 2000 years before Odyssey. In terms of gameplay, it's exactly like the gameplay loop in the base game, but at least they added some new useful abilities, like the one that builds your adrenaline meter and the one that allows dead bodies to disappear after assassinating them. Despite this though, Legacy of the First Blade is a very bad DLC in my eyes, as it just spits in the lore of Assassin's Creed. The Fate of Atlantis also does things very similarly to the Legacy of the First Blade, where they break the law of the series in all types of ways. Firstly, it goes over the top in its fantasy elements with the Isu, which makes no sense since this is a sci-fi series. Secondly, they ruin some characters like Otsoberg. I don't get why they suddenly introduced him again in one scene just to sideline him again in that specific scene. A complete waste of a character in my opinion. The biggest mistake they definitely made was getting the Sixth Sense wrong and thinking it was knowledge, but the Sixth Sense is actually time, which was explained in Brotherhood, so I don't get how they managed to mess up that one. The gameplay was at least a bit better than the base game, as they introduced new enemies with new moves that you had to get used to. It looked a bit over the top with the superhero moves, but at least they tried to add something new. So yeah, in conclusion, the main reason why I have the Odyssey DLC so low on my list is because they have such big inconsistencies with the lore of the series. Some of the other DLCs do break lore of the series, but not as bad as Odyssey did. Next, we have the Dawn of Ragnarok DLC, which I have ranked so low due to the same reasons I gave Fate of Atlantis such a low rating. Why in the world are we exploring Muspelheim in Assassin's Creed? This is a sci-fi game, not a fantasy game. This has no place in the series in my opinion. And also, isn't Assassin's Creed supposed to be about the assassins? Why in the world are we exploring the backstory of Odin instead? And the worst thing is, the story of Odin and his character wasn't really progressed much in this game. The only good thing I can say about this is that they at least introduced some new weapons, even though there were not much new combos that you could do with them. They also introduced some new powers, but I have never been a fan of them, as I feel like they don't belong in this series. So yeah, those are the reasons why I have this so low on my list. It steers too far from the Assassin's Creed formula and instead goes towards the fantasy approach that doesn't suit this franchise. The Wrath of the Druids is yet another DLC that has little to do with Assassin's Creed. It's just another filler story where Eivor goes to try and forge another alliance that is not really interesting in my opinion. The story is really predictable and does nothing new for Eivor's character. We have some more fantasy elements with us, like fighting werewolves, which is something I was not surprised by since this series really wants to go in a fantasy direction, despite it really being a more grounded sci-fi in the past. At the end of it, I was just questioning why I even bothered playing it, which is why it's so low on this list. The Last Maharaja is definitely one of the most boring DLCs I have ever played in my life. The story was not really interesting, plus it was supported by the laziest animations from a Ubisoft game ever, which made the whole experience even worse. They also didn't bother to mocap some important scenes, which made the DLC feel like an afterthought. There really isn't much to say about this one. It feels lazily made and the mission structure was barely interesting. The overall premise of the story was quite boring as well, which is why it's so low on the list. The Tyranny of King Washington felt like a really wasted DLC to me. I wish they would have done another story exploring Connor's character, as he has so much potential, but instead they decided to go with another story where Washington becomes evil. What's worse is that it does not really matter in the end, as it's just a dream, which is something I don't really like stories doing. It feels like a complete waste of time. Another thing that I did not really like was the introduction of the spirit animal abilities, as it felt a bit too much in my opinion. But I felt like it wasn't as bad as what comes later in the series, and there is still some fun that you can have with these powers in the game. Another thing that they really wasted was introducing Connor's mother back into his life again. When Connor sees his mother again, he just acts very surprised and questions it for that scene only, but after that he doesn't really mention it again. They should have explored their bond a bit more, and I feel like they really wasted an opportunity here. Overall, this DLC doesn't do much for me, as at the end of the day it was just a dream that did not matter, and it did not do enough to progress Connor's growth as a character. Siege of Paris is definitely the best Valhalla DLC for me, and that's because of its infiltration missions. They reward you for using social stealth and give you unique cutscenes if you get through an area using only stealth. They also encourage you to use social stealth, which was not utilized enough in the main game. It hardly leans into fantasy elements as well, which is a huge plus for me. However, it still has its problems. The story is not really that interesting and is accompanied by characters that can be annoying. Also, it has little to do with the assassins once again due to the fact that Eivor does not care about the Order, so it's just another alliance quest. If your DLC has little to do with the assassins, then why even call this game Assassin's Creed? It also doesn't progress Eivor as much as a character, which is why this DLC is not that high up on my list. I don't really feel like fantasy elements suit this franchise, cause at the end of the day this is a grounded sci-fi series. I hate to sound like a broken record, but I can't help it because so many of these games are trying to go in the fantasy route, which is what Curse of the Pharaoh tries to do. It's higher than the other fantasy DLCs cause it's supported by Bayek, who has some good story moments in this expansion, and the story can be quite engaging at times. The world is also very beautiful, which encourages you to explore more. It also has a deep meaning for Bayek, as his religion is important to him and his countrymen as a whole. The reason why it's low on my list though is that it focuses too much on its fantasy elements while ignoring the assassin elements, which is not what Assassin's Creed is about. Sure, they do include some assassin elements, but they are very basic and it doesn't delve deeper enough, which is probably Origin's biggest problem as a whole. I used to like the Hidden One DLCs a lot more in the past, but now that I've looked deeper into it, it's kinda disappointing. I appreciate that the whole focus of this DLC was dedicated to establishing one of the tenets of the creed, but I feel like they did not delve deep enough into it. It's very surface level and they use Gamilat to get his point across, which made little sense to me since he was not a member of the Hidden Ones. It made the whole thing feel less meaningful. The enemies were also so forgettable, with them being completely evil, which made their confessions feel so weak. This DLC was supposed to be about the foundations of the Order, and instead we got some surface level content without the meaningful dialogue that the older games used to have. It should have delved deeper into the creed, and I'm kind of disappointed that they took the easy route, which is why this DLC is not higher up on my list. I like the Jack the Ripper DLC much more than the base game of Syndicate, and that's because it was much more focused on its tone. Syndicate was trying to be serious and goofy at the same time, which made it feel like it was very conflicted with what it was trying to be. This was not the case in the Jack the Ripper DLC, as it's more focused on its serious tone. It shows how Evie and Jacob have grown as characters and how they are dealing with the fallout of one of their students becoming completely evil. They tried to make Jack really scary, but I think they might have gone overboard with it. He looks absolutely ridiculous with that paper bag on his head, and when you play as him, there are many words that appear on the screen to try to show you that he is very evil. I think his actions were enough to show that he was terrifying, so it kind of feels unnecessary to add all of those words. This combined with his paper bag made me take him less seriously. The fear mechanics were also not really my cup of tea, even though it could be fun at times as it looked a bit over the top, but it's not the worst thing in this DLC. Despite its shortcomings, I think it's one of the more decent DLCs in the series because it's focused in what it wants to be and it tells a decent story. The DLCs in Assassin's Creed 2 are kind of a mixed bag for me. On one hand, it has some great character moments for Ezio, like meeting Machiavelli and his speech in the Bonfire of the Vanities, but on the other hand, it completely breaks the pacing of Assassin's Creed 2. The game has close to perfect pacing if you cut this out because the DLC drags on for a bit too long. The mission where Ezio is finally made an assassin sets him up for a very big mission not something of a smaller scale like this DLC, so it doesn't make that much sense. The premise is also very weird, with them wanting to hide the piece of Eden in Folly instead of with the assassins where you will be much more secure. The mission structure is also not too interesting, as it just has you assassinate targets just to mimic the first game in a very cookie cutter way that's not done that creatively. There's also not much done to spice up the mission, so it feels like the same old same old. It brings the quality of AC2 down as it has subpar content along with bad pacing. The only reason why it's not lower on my list is because Ezio has some great moments that progresses his character and makes his whole story feel much more meaningful. Freedom Cry was a decent DLC to me as we were exploring Adewale, who was already an interesting character in Black Flag. I enjoyed following him through this story and seeing how he decided to put the Assassin Order on hold to fight for his people, which is really respectable. The gameplay is also quite fun since it's basically Black Flag 2.0. My only gripe with this DLC is that Adewale did not really change much as a character in this DLC. He was mostly the same guy he was in Black Flag, and there was not enough conflict in this game to change him. Don't get me wrong though, he gives a great performance in this game and his story was very interesting to follow, but I just wish they did more to progress him as a character. The Lost Archive is quite underrated in my opinion, and I kinda get it cause it does not have traditional AC gameplay. But if you decide to look past this, the story it manages to tell is one of the best in this series. I feel like this method of environmental storytelling really suits this as it shows the gradual degradation of Clay's mind. The sound design also really helps to immerse you in Clay's tragic story. There were so many big moments that were revealed in the story that completely changed the story as a whole and gave more meaning to it. The story really carries this DLC because if the story was subpar, this DLC will be much lower on my list as its gameplay can be pretty hit or miss sometimes. Dead Kings is a really good DLC. It's a perfect continuation of Arnold's story with him being very cynical and depressed after losing the one he loved. His chemistry with Leon was excellent as they were characters with opposing ideals, yet their relationship was very well developed and believable. The premise of the story was interesting as well, and the characters were well written. There were interesting gameplay additions like the guillotine gun and new enemy archetypes to spice up the combat. Overall, it was a really good DLC and probably one of the best DLCs I have ever played. My favorite DLC is definitely the Da Vinci Disappearance. More Leonardo and Ezio content is always excellent, especially with them finding out the location of the Grand Temple. The mission structure was excellent as well, with many missions requiring stealth, combat and using all of your free running abilities. Another thing that I really like is the genuine relationship between Leonardo and Salai, even though they shared no scenes together. It was really believable and they executed it so well. It's such an excellent DLC and I never get tired of playing it through over and over again. At the end of the day, this is all just my opinion, which is why I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What is your favorite Assassin's Creed DLC? Be sure to say your thoughts, and with that being said, this has been 2367 Ruben signing out.